So in this video we're going to talk about why really civil servants are taking a high risk approach by striking at the moment over pensions. That's because if you work in the public sector you enjoy pensions the like of which most of us in the private sector have long since forgotten about. So let's take a look at pensions and let's take a look at why public sector pensions are really quite a benefit and something that most civil servants will do well to hang on to. Okay, so pensions, first of all, how do you provide for the fact that when you stop working you're basically not going to have an income? Most of us enjoy an income while we work, but the problem is when you retire, of course, you've got to live on something. Now, one option is the state. There is a state pension. Trouble is, it's not very much. Around about £100 a week, and who knows, in years to come it might even be reduced or abolished, or it may not keep pace with inflation. So a little bit dangerous to rely on that as your sole source of retirement income, although plenty of people seem happy to do just that. So alternatives are basically to provide some form of separate pension. And these come in basically two varieties. So your employer might help you out with some sort of pension contribution, or if you work for the state, then the government, which means the taxpayer, might be helping to fund your retirement. So the basic two types of pension are known, and there's lots of jargon around these, as the defined contribution or money purchase plan. And that's the type that many private sector employees are in these days, or the preferable, nice if you can find one, defined benefit, or what used to be called final salary scheme. Now that's the type that a lot of companies in the UK used to offer, but for very good reasons have unfortunately started to close them down, and that's the type that state employees still get, and basically represents a pretty substantial part of their pay and perks. Now the government is trying to tweak this type of pension, but before we go into that, let's take a quick look at what makes that different to that. And the answer in a word is risk. Basically, with this sort of pension, as an employee, you bear all of the risk. The risk being that you still won't have enough money to live on when you retire. With this type of pension, either your employer or the taxpayer, for a state employee, bears all the risk, because you know in advance what your pension is going to be. Okay, so in essence, just to summarise that last point, here's in very broad terms how pensions work. Now I'm not going to go into all the details of annuities and so on in this video, but here in principle is how the defined contribution or money purchase plan works. And these have various names. Under here you've got things like the stakeholder pension, that's the slightly old-fashioned version of the pension scheme, and you've also got things like the self-invested personal pension, where there's a certain amount of choice about what goes in. So in essence the principle of the thing is this: you create a fund by putting fixed contributions in. Now, who's paying these fixed sums? If you work for a company, like the one I work for, it'll be your employer putting in, let's say, 3% of your salary, and then you might put in another 3% yourself. But the point is, it's a fixed amount, because it's 3 or 5 or 10% of whatever your monthly salary is. So in a corporate scheme, basically that could be the employer and you contributing. And here's the problem. A fixed sum goes in, that's invested by an insurance company in stocks and shares and bonds and so on. So names like Scottish Widows, Standard Life and so on. And then out the other end, when you retire, comes a lump sum. Now, that lump sum can be used in various ways when you retire. Some of it can be taken literally as a tax-free cash amount to spend immediately. Some people will often use to buy what's called an annuity, i.e. an income stream when they retire. But the problem with money purchase plans as an employee is you have absolutely no idea how big that lump sum is going to be. That depends on investment returns between now and when you retire, and various other factors like the charges that the fund is extracting. So all the risk is on your shoulders. The more you put in, the more you'll get out, but you don't really know how that relationship's going to work until you retire. And if the stock market crashes the day before you do retire, tough. Your fund is going to be worth an awful lot less, which means if you use it to buy an income to live on when you're retired, you'll get a much lower income. So, no surprise, this is the type of scheme employers increasingly favour. There are very, very few companies around now, in 10 years there may be none, that offer the alternative, called the defined benefit scheme. And that's because for a company, this one's great. They just decide what percentage of your salary to contribute. They know exactly how much that's going to be every month and every year, and they don't have to worry about what you've got at the other end when you retire. That's your problem. Okay, so what is the alternative? The alternative is what all public servants still get. That means teachers, firemen and so on. And frankly, most private sector employees would love to have, but most no longer do. So what is that? It's called a defined benefit scheme, and broadly speaking, it works like this. It changes the risk around. So, defined benefit. This time, what comes out when you retire is guaranteed. It's not a lump sum, it's an actual pension, usually. Now these go by various names, but final salary or average life contributions, essentially what your employer might be doing, just to take an example, is saying, right, as long as you work for this company for a certain number of years, or as long as you stay in that government department for a certain number of years, every year you'll accrue basically a percentage, a fraction, if you like, of your final pension. So for example, if every year you accrue a 60th of your final salary as a pension, if you stay with the company for 30 years, you'll have accrued 30 60ths, so whatever your final salary is on the day you retire, half of that becomes your pension. And quite often it'll be index linked, which means linked to inflation, which is even better. So basically, there is normally a way that your final pension when you retire is calculated, but the point is it's guaranteed and linked typically to your earnings either when you retire, it's called final salary, or it might be calculated based on your average earnings over the time you worked, which will probably give you something of a lower pension. Okay, at the other end, how much needs to go in from your employer or you or the government, depending on who you work for, to make sure you've got a guaranteed pension? Well, there's the question mark. That is something, if you work for a company, that your firm has got to worry about. How much do they need to put in to make sure you get 30 60th of your final salary when you retire? Because over the life of your work at your firm or work for a government or whoever you work for, basically what's going to happen is the fund, the pension fund, will build up assets. This is before you retire. It knows there's a liability out there, i.e. your future pension, which is guaranteed, don't forget, and therefore at any point in time, the scheme, these are stocks and shares and bonds, these assets, the scheme's assets minus its liability to pensioners will give rise to a surplus or more likely a deficit. And one of the reasons why companies have been chopping this sort of scheme and saying, no, we can't afford to do this, we can't offer guaranteed pensions anymore, is because most of them are running deficits, or many are running deficits. Someone once joked recently that Rolls-Royce was a pension black hole with an engineering company bolted on the side, because these deficits can be enormous if you take all employees in one company into account. And many companies have been looking at their pension funds and thinking, crikey, unless we put loads in, which we're not prepared to do, there's not going to be enough to pay all these pension commitments we've been making to our employees. Okay, and of course that shortfall arises for a number of reasons. One is, if these assets don't grow quickly enough, for example, anyone investing in the FTSE 100 over the last 10 years has made next to nothing. So, one problem is the pension fund can't grow its assets fast enough to meet its liabilities. And of course, these liabilities to pay pensions are based on some big estimates, like how long you're going to live. And we're all living longer. So, basically, there are plenty of companies who've looked at this and thought, well, that deficit is unsustainable. Solution, let's just cut this type of scheme out. They normally start with new employees and say, well, you're not eligible, you have to go into the old money purchase thing where we know how much we're going to pay in. But many companies are starting to shut the scheme even to existing employees. Why not the government? Well, how big's the government's problem? The government offers state employees this type of pension, final salary, guaranteed style pension. The size of the government's deficit, that's taking into account all of the liabilities, potentially future liabilities to state employees, is in the order of between 1 and 2 trillion sterling, depending on who you talk to. If that liability was recognised on the government's balance sheet, it'll be functionally bust almost. Because the problem is this: what assets does the government have to pay that huge liability to future pensioners? And the answer is not much, because the government's scheme is unfunded, as it's called. That is to say, there is no pot set aside to pay teachers' pensions, judges' pensions, medics' pensions. The theory, which is somewhat flawed, is that future generations of taxpayers will cough up enough money when the time comes to pay all of the pensions of the people already working for the state. And the reason that theory is flawed is because UK demographics are working against it. We're all getting older, okay? People are having fewer children. We don't need them to go out and work in fields or go up chimneys anymore. And basically the population's ageing, and more people are spending more and more time in retirement. So it's all very well saying future taxpayers will cover the bill, but that's quite a burden to expect future taxpayers to cover. So the government is looking at a way around this problem. It's got this big liability, this big deficit hanging over it. Everyone knows that state pensions are increasingly unaffordable, much as though we'd all love to have one. I'm not saying that it's a bad idea in principle, it's just that in practice it's very, very difficult to justify. So the government's looking at ways to cut the size and scale of these defined benefit state pensions. So at the moment, for example, they're looking at asking teachers to make a slightly bigger contribution, because if you're a teacher, the government puts some money in, you put some money in, around 6-7% at the moment, and the government would like to up that contribution. Or you can do things like move away from final salary. Problem with that, you see, is that if someone gets a promotion the year before they retire, that neatly boosts their pension. So you can move away from that to average career earnings based pensions, for example. But whichever way you look at it, and I'll give you some numbers in a moment, it's hard to argue that public sector pensions are sustainable. They're great, but they're not sustainable. The fact that so many companies have chopped that style of scheme tells you that the government has got to do something about it sooner or later, because the private sector is normally ahead of the public sector on this kind of stuff. So, how good is a defined benefit pension versus the sort of money purchase pension that I talked about earlier on? Well, here's some stats from Hargreaves Lansdown. Let's say you're working in the private sector and you'd like a pension of £24,000 per year. Now, if you think about it, if you were working in the public sector, if your salary was say £48,000 and you were working off a pension of 30/60ths when you retire, the state would guarantee that £24,000. But supposing you're in the private sector and no one's guaranteeing the £24,000, what size of a pot would you need to have accumulated somehow as a lump sum by the time you retire? And the answer is around £500,000, £500,000 to buy an index-linked pension of £24,000 as a private sector employee. And that's comparing, let's say, someone who starts work age 23, retires age 60, that's a 37-year career, and they kick off on a salary of around £25,000. Another way of looking at it based on those stats is that whilst your teacher's got a guaranteed pension coming out the other end, your private sector employee, assuming investment returns over those 37 years of 6%, which is reasonably ambitious, don't forget the FTSE's been flat for 10 years, would need to be contributing something like £600 a month from the start. And how many people can afford to set aside £600 a month? Or put it another way, on a salary of around £25,000 as a starting salary, that's 30% of your earnings. And basically, somebody who works in the state on a final salary scheme based on, let's say, finishing on 48,000, so they get 24 as half of that, isn't putting away anything like 30% of their salary. As I mentioned just now, teachers might contribute 6 or 7, and the government would like to up that to around 10. And I have to say, although I don't agree with everything the government does, that extra little contribution doesn't seem like too high a price to pay for what is a pretty generous pension scheme. So the message here is basically, although we have absolutely nothing against teachers per se, the pension arrangement enjoyed by many civil servants is fantastically generous. And for anyone thinking, well, the reason it's generous is because people in the public sector get paid less than people in the private sector, so the pension has to compensate for that, that's simply no longer true. The Policy Exchange have done some research that shows that, well, here's a couple of stats. First of all, between 2001 and 2009, public sector employees saw their real pay go up 29%. That's 3 times faster than the rate in the private sector. And the end result, this is largely thanks to some of the things Gordon Brown did to boost the state, was that your average public sector worker now earns slightly more than your average private sector worker. So there isn't really an argument anymore to be made for the fact that public sector pensions must be generous because in some way that compensates for lower salaries. So all in all, I'm afraid civil servants are looking at their pensions being reduced one way or another, ideally sooner rather than later. The fact they don't like it much isn't a reason for the government not to try to do it.